Hi everyone, I'm Scott Schneider. This is Stereo Niche. And this week we're going to talk about a big guy here, the Marantz 2500. All right, so this week I thought I would do a little video on the Marantz 2500. I just got it back from my tech. He's been updating some caps and things like that, and so I got it back from him, and while I had it out, I thought instead of putting it back on the shelf, why not do a quick little video about it and, you know, talk through it a bit. So this is the Marantz 2500, and it came out in 1977. And in that year, it was the biggest receiver, most powerful receiver on the market, and heads above everyone else. No one was at this level by any means, by any stretch of the imagination. The closest I think I saw was maybe, ironically, a Fisher unit at 170 watts, and that may have been the closest one. Other offerings from Technics, theirs was 165. And let's see, Kenwood had their KRS 9600. I think it was 160 watts. Pioneer SX 1250, 160 watts. So, you know, they took off and threw out a monster in every sense of the imagination that just surpassed everyone. And I'm sure that in probably every stereo shop of that year, if you didn't have the Marantz line, you probably were tired of every customer coming in going, wow, did you see them? You know, you got Marantz because they've got the biggest dog out there, you know. I'm sure that it was a tough year for the non-Marantz dealerships to deal with, because you had this massive, most powerful, you know, receiver by a long shot. And I have a feeling it just probably sucked all the oxygen out of the market as far as noise, you know, out there, and just, you know, word of mouth probably spread very quickly. So it is impressive. When it comes to physical size, you know, I've seen some others. I have a 1980, and they don't, you know, I've seen all of the monsters, and they don't really rank up there as far as size is concerned. It's not massive in that regard. It's actually narrower than the Sansui 9090. I think the 9090 is about, you know, 2 inches wider, but where it makes up in the front width, it certainly makes up for in the depth. These are pretty deep, whereas most receivers are anywhere about 18 inches roughly. I think these are around 21 roughly from knob to the antenna on the back. So pretty deep. It looks almost square when you see it from the top. So they make up for it in that regard, and they're 60 pounds, so, you know, pretty hefty. Not up there with some of the largest dedicated amps that are, you know, in the hundreds of pounds by any means, but for 1977, when this came out, this was a beast, and you know, in every sense. And the real emphasis here on this receiver is the amp. The amp is the star of the show. It got all kind of rave reviews. Stereo Review did an in-depth review of it in early 1978, and that's pretty much everything they talked about. Their point is that in this amplifier ranks up there with dedicated separate components of the day, and it, you know, all of the qualities, everything they put into it, from the tuner section to every other area, the preamp, was so good that they said it ranks as separate components, which, you know, is a pretty big deal. You put in separate components because, you know, when you're dedicating your energy into one unit, one dedicated unit, then your expectation is the quality is much higher. And here, they wrapped it all into one box for you. So quite an impressive unit. Of course, it looks like all of the other Marantzes. It has that same style that all of the other Marantzes from the 70s, so the Super Scope era, have. The one difference, of course, is this really cool thing right here in the front. Takes up the front top left quadrant, and that's the scope. And I showed you some video up front of the scope, in operation, and that certainly set it apart from everything else, as well as the huge amplifier and the quality of that amp. So what a gauntlet that they threw down to everyone to say, hey, listen, we're here to stay, we're here to own the market, and here's not only the most powerful receiver. By the way, we got this cool scope in there too that sets it apart from everything else. So I can only imagine the amount of word of mouth mention of talk. Everybody who was in the stereo audio world were just probably sick of hearing about the Marantz 2500 in 1977. Stereo Review went on, and not only is it a powerhouse, at 250 watts at 8 ohm. The other thing they were quite impressed with was that it had such a great spec at 4 ohm, and it cranked out 330 watts at 4 ohm. And they were just over the top impressed with the specs of this unit and how much it performed. So they went on at great length. I'll put that here in the video so you can see that. But wow, I looked at a few of the amplifiers of the day, and you really had to go way up. If you were going to beat 250 watts, you had to really throw a lot of money at it. Some of the dedicated amps that were out there at the time, the Pioneer spec amp came in at 250 watts for it. The Sensui AU20000 integrated amp, 170 watts out there. Now it's an impressive amp, of course, but man, you can get a lot more watts in this receiver here. The Luxman M6000, 300 watts, but man, you paid for it, right? That was the price of a car back then. So cost a lot of money. There were other amps, but what the Stereo Review said is you can go for those amps, but then you're gonna have to, of course, you got to buy a preamp and you got to buy everything else to go with it, or you can buy the same quality in the Marantz 2500. So that was what was going on in 1977 and what Marantz put out there on the table, which I would love to have a time machine and go back and walk into a stereo store of the day in 1977 and say, hey, what's the biggest buzz on the market? I have a feeling the first thing they would say is the Marantz. So quite cool. I'm going to give you some up close shots, show you how cool these actually look up close. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the features. All right, you got to see that up close and see how cool is the 2500. Now, as I mentioned, it looks just like all the other Marantzes you've seen of the time frame, but a little more massive, cool scope, but everything else is relatively the same, to be honest. So by the way, I've got a new camera and I've been struggling with looking at the lens rather than the screen off to the side. I'm not used to seeing myself, and so I've been looking at that more than I've been looking at you guys, so I'm going to try to fix that. So now let's take a look at some of the features and go through some of the specs and some of the ratings that I do and see where it ranks with everything else. So as I always do, it's the Marantz 2500. I could find that these were made from 77 to 79. I use an Marantz guide, and that's what that information it had, which looks close. I'm sure they came up pretty close. 77 is the year that it appears to have come out. And it retailed for, and the Marantz guide said $15.95, but when I looked in the advertisements of the day, it said, and in the stereo review, it said $17.50. So, you know, not sure which one is more accurate, but that's what both of them said. I also, while I was doing some research, found as far as number of units produced, that these were made around 1,600 units or so. The 2600 that came a year later, they made around 900 of those units. So a little more rare. 1,600, not a lot compared to a lot of other units like the 20 in the 22s, 2235, 40. They made tens of thousands of those units. So 1,600 still a fairly small number of units, and of course, you know, 900. It shows why you don't run across 2600s that often. There just really, you know, weren't that many. So moving on, let's see. So specs here, I start off with the power side of things. We've talked about it at length. This has 250 watts. So for 250 watts, it gets 30 points. On to that 4 ohm spec, which is very important. And it rates, got a 4 ohm spec, rates 330 watts for that, gets 30 points. By the way, that reminds me, a little bit of a segue here, but I just happened to be chatting with somebody making some comments on one of my prior videos. And in a prior video, I didn't give a unit. I think it's actually the Sansui 881. I didn't denote that it could handle a 4 ohm load. And the reason I didn't is because I couldn't confirm it. And the information I had at the time didn't say that. And so I'm not going to make an assumption that it can do 4 ohms unless I actually see it. There's a big discussion also, by the way, on the Pioneer SX 1980. The documentation and the specs that is released on it, I don't recall it saying that it does 4 ohm load. Now, on the back, it does say if you want to connect 2 speakers, you can connect 2 8 ohms, which would mean that it should be able to handle 4. But interestingly enough, it just didn't seem to highlight the fact that it has a spec for 4 ohm, unlike the Marantz here that very much denoted it can do 4 ohm. So anyway, quick segue on that. Moving on here into the side of things, the phono side of things. It'll handle 2 phonos, cartridges, so it gets 20 points for that. Doesn't have any features for MC cartridges, so no points for that. On to auxiliary. You can hook up 3 more sources. You essentially have the auxiliary and 2 tape monitors, and that's it. And I found that a little surprising for such a large unit. But again, as I mentioned, the emphasis here is on the quality of the amplifier. That's what they put, you know, the majority of their effort into. Has balance, gets 5 points. Has a loudness, gets 5 points. Doesn't have a volume mute switch that I could find. On to tone controls, has the bass, mid, and treble. That's one area that the stereo review raved about, by the way, is what great control that the tone controls have. You get a lot of control with them. Has high-low filters, has a power meter. Instead of a power meter, of course, it's a scope, which is kind of cool. So, you know, didn't give extra points for it being a scope, but gave it 20 points for having a power meter. Has pre-out, aux in, and there is a wood case that comes with it. And I actually have this case, but I find it to be rather ugly, to be blunt. And it's not much of a case. It's more like a frame that goes around it. It locks in on both sides and then goes on the top. It doesn't have a bottom plate. So I'm actually going to get a custom one made that's similar to the original cabinets that you get with the other models. And I'm going to have a couple. I have two of these, so I'm going to have one of those made, two of those made for them. Probably make an extra or two because I have a feeling some others will want kind of a case like that as well. But anyway, a wood case or a wood cabinet frame was optional. And interestingly enough, also in that, it comes in a flat pack. So the sides came flat and then the top in there with the screws that went with it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Moving on here, AC connections has one switched, one unswitched. Not a lot of AC connections for such a huge box, but 10 and 5 points each. And then speakers, it'll handle 2 sets of speakers, as we said, 4 ohm included. So when we total all that up, it only comes to 240 points. Not much really in the way my little rating system works here, but again, the emphasis is all around the power side of things and the quality of that power. And you know, the fact that you can certainly hook up some 4 ohm speakers and run with them. That's where they focused, and they gave you a cool scope to go with it. I will say the power seems ample. You don't have to turn the volume knob much to get things cranking. That was the big wow kind of factor I had immediately when I turned this thing on. It was driving these Pioneer speakers I have hooked up at the moment with ease. I mean, complete ease. It was just effortless. It didn't take much to get them going, which is pretty impressive. It does take a little power for these, and this has more than ample power for that. So, you know, I wouldn't say you probably want to run it with something that is extremely hard, like Infinities or Magnepans. Not that it couldn't do it, but my preference would probably be a different kind of amp for that. But for really anything else, I think this thing would tackle it with a plum and just, make any of your speakers a better speaker for having it attached to them. So awesome receiver. And, I think Marantz certainly set a very, very high mark. And they haven't gone through the other ones yet, but, when we look and take a review of those other monster receivers, I think, we need to take closer note to how good is the amplification on those. Was it just a number, or, was it beefy as well, and did it have, the quality that these have? Let me know what you guys have experienced with these as well. I'm sure quite a few have, a 2500 or maybe even a 2600. That would be nice. Let me know what you guys think. Hope you appreciate it this week. Going to get better at this camera. I'm still getting used to looking at the lens the right way, so that's getting to me a bit. But it's going to take some time to get used to it. Anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. As always, want to keep up with the next video, hit subscribe. Want to make sure you get notified, hit that bell. We'll see you next time.